They laughed when the bride arrived with no shoes, until the mountain man carried her inside. Colorado Territory, a wind-battered town in the Rocky Mountains. Autumn, 1872. Dust swirled around the wooden chapel like a ghost refusing to settle. The old building groaned under the sharp breath of the mountain wind. Its steeple bent slightly eastward, as if it too did not care much for the ceremony about to unfold within. The buckboard wagon creaked to a halt, its wheels caked in red clay. From it stepped a girl who did not belong to that stage, not in the way she was dressed. Her name was Mary May, and her wedding dress had once been ivory but now clung to her legs in dull creases and dirt. There were no pearls at her throat, no veil, no satin gloves, and no shoes. Her bare feet touched the earth like she was greeting it, like she belonged more to the land than to the altar she was being dragged toward. Mud streaked her ankles, a thorn clung to her hem. From the crowd gathered outside the church, the whispers began like crackling brush fire. Did she forget her boots? No, she ain't got any. Look at her. Barefoot. On her weddin' day. Poor thing's too broke to marry decent. Or too wild. Her mother, rigid and pale in her Sunday dress, gripped Mary's arm tighter. "Keep walking," she hissed through clenched teeth. "You'll shame this family no more than you already have." Her father stood a few steps behind, chewing the inside of his cheek, eyes trained on a point, far away from his daughter's shame. Mary didn't speak. Her face was calm, too calm, but inside her chest, something kicked against its cage. Ahead, the church doors hung open, and in the threshold stood Harlan Dodd, a man in his late 40s with a gut built from cattle money and whiskey, wearing a brown coat 2 sizes too fine for his posture. His mustache curled like it was smirking, even when the rest of his face did not. He didn't smile when he saw Mary. He looked at her feet first, then her face. Then he turned to the preacher with a small shake of the head, as if apologizing for the quality of his purchase. Mary paused at the bottom step. The wind tugged her skirt. "Keep going," her mother snapped again, under her breath. "We did not come all this way for you to turn into a joke now." Mary looked at the church, looked at the man inside it, looked at her own hands. Then she stepped forward, one bare foot onto the wooden step, then another. The boards were cold beneath her skin. As she reached the threshold, the crowd shifted, murmured, some chuckled under their breath. And then came the first laugh, sharp, dry, cruel. It broke the spell. A second laugh joined. Then another, like coyotes circling a limping deer. Mary's chest rose, her cheeks burned, her fingers twitched at her sides, and just as she crossed the threshold, just as the preacher opened his mouth and Harlan reached lazily for her hand, the church doors slammed open behind her, with a force that sent a ripple through the room. Wind screamed through the opening, extinguishing a few candles. Hats blew sideways. Skirts rustled. And there, in the doorway, stood Boon Calder, 6 feet and some inches of unshaven mountain silence, wrapped in a dark fur coat that bore the scent of pine and ash. His boots were covered in frost. His eyes, ice blue and still as lake water in winter, swept the room once, landing on Mary. The laughter died like a shot wool. No one moved. Boon didn't blink. He took a step forward into the church, and with it came a hush so thick you could slice it with a knife. Someone whispered from the back, barely audible, "Is that Boon Calder?" Mary turned slowly to face him. She did not smile, but something in her shoulders, until that moment tight as rope, eased, just slightly. Boon stared at her, and only her, and the mountain wind shut the door gently behind him. Boon Calder took one step into the chapel, then another. His boots thudded against the old wood like the beat of a war drum, slow, steady, final. The air around him carried the sharp scent of pine, fur, and the kind of cold that clung to a man who had not stood among crowds in many years. His eyes never left Mary May, not for a moment. The preacher, fingers trembling around his Bible, cleared his throat. "Sir," he stammered, "are you here to witness the union?" Boone didn't speak. From the front of the room, Harlan Dodd stepped forward, his face blotched red with disbelief. "This is my wedding," he growled. "I don't know who you think you are, but you best turn around and walk back out the way you came." Still no answer. Boone's silence was louder than any man's threats. Mary stood motionless between them, eyes wide, and then, just for an instant, a flicker of memory rose behind her gaze. Snow falling, a crackling fire, the same cold eyes, softer then, peering at her across a blanket. But it disappeared as quickly as it came. Boone took one more step forward, then another. The crowd parted instinctively. No one dared stand in his path. When he reached Mary, he didn't ask. He didn't speak. He bent down and lifted her off the ground. Gasps broke from every corner of the chapel. Her veil fluttered as his arms wrapped beneath her knees and shoulders. She was weightless in his grip, stunned, her hands pressed to his chest. "Boone," she breathed, "don't do this." His voice came quiet but strong. "You are not something to be handed over to scavengers." Harlan surged forward, pushing past a row of onlookers. His hand went straight for the revolver on his hip. "You son of a—" Boone turned toward him. No sudden movement, just a slow, deliberate shift. But his eyes, those pale, frozen eyes, locked onto Harlan's and held him there. Harlan's fingers froze above the gun. Boone didn't need a weapon. He was the weapon. The tension in the room twisted tighter than a drawn bowstring. And then, a whisper, barely audible, from the back pew. "Boon Calder," an old woman said, voice thin with awe. "That's him. Lives alone in the high ridge. Hasn't come down in 10 years. Someone else murmured, "They say he killed a bear once. Bare hands. Never said a word about it." The crowd, once smug and judgmental, now stood still as fence posts, eyes darting from Boone to Mary, to the useless preacher. Mary looked up at Boone. She should have felt fear, but she didn't. Only warmth, and a strange, aching calm. Boone turned away from the altar, from the preacher, from Harlan's stunned silence and the weight of the town's eyes. He walked toward the chapel doors, with Mary in his arms. No one dared stop him. At the threshold, wind pressed in once more, whistling through the open doors. He stepped outside, and behind him, no one laughed. Boon Calder swung her up onto the saddle like she weighed no more than a bag of pine shavings. The leather creaked beneath her as she steadied herself, fingers gripping the worn horn of the saddle. Her heart was still galloping in her chest, louder than the wind in her ears. The crowd behind them had vanished into the darkness. The chapel lights faded behind the trees as Boone mounted the horse behind her. He gave no call, no whip of the reins, just a soft click of the tongue, and the horse began to move. Mary's breath fogged in the cold air. She looked straight ahead, the forest swallowing them tree by tree. Branches reached like fingers across their path, dried leaves crunched beneath the hooves. Finally, she asked, her voice trembling, "Why did you do that?" Boone's voice came from behind her, close and steady. "Were you planning to spend the rest of your life in a cage?" She didn't answer, but her throat tightened, and her hands gripped the saddle tighter. They rode deeper into the woods. No moon, only the stars above, distant, indifferent witnesses. The only sounds were the wind threading through pine, the snort of the horse, and the rhythm of hooves striking frozen earth. Mary closed her eyes and remembered. The parlor lesson, the stiff corsets, the way her mother slapped her wrist for stitching imperfectly. The books taken away from her when they were not ladylike. The boy she once loved, John Teller, the son of a farrier, sent away with a threat the moment her father found out. She had been taught to smile, to sit, to serve, but never to want. The silence between her and Boone was not comfortable. It was charged, heavy with what was not said. He didn't touch her, didn't look at her the way men usually did, but there was a tension in his stillness, a watchfulness, as if he were always one breath from turning into something feral. Like a wolf raised too long in solitude. Hours passed. The cold deepened. At last, Boone slowed the horse near a bend in a creek. The water was half frozen, edges crusted with ice. He dismounted without a word, then helped her down. Mary's legs wobbled. Her bare feet were numb. Boon offered her his coat. She hesitated, then took it. He moved with quiet precision, gathering branches, striking flint, building a fire. She sat across from him, hugging her knees beneath the coat. The flames licked upward, casting flickers of gold on his face. He said nothing. She stared into the fire, her thoughts loud, her chest louder. Then, while Boon's back was turned, she ran. She didn't know where she was going, just away, anywhere but here. But after 3 steps, snap! Pain shot up her right leg like lightning. She collapsed with a cry, her foot caught in a crude metal snare hidden beneath the leaves. Boon was beside her in seconds. His knife was out, slicing through the trap before she could scream again. He picked her up, cradling her to his chest as if she were fragile glass, and carried her back to the fire. She thrashed weakly. "Why do you care?" His jaw clenched, his eyes burned, but not with anger. "Because," he said, kneeling beside her, "you were the only thing that ever made me feel human again." His voice cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough to shatter the silence between them. Mary's breath hitched. She looked at him, truly looked, and, for the first time, realized she knew nothing about the man who had just saved her. Again. And she couldn't look away. The cabin was nestled in a grove of spruce, half swallowed by brush and shadow, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. It leaned a little to the left but stood firm, built by hand, not for comfort, but for survival. Inside, the scent of pine smoke, iron from the fire grate, and a faint touch of roasted meat hung in the air. A pot simmered slowly above the flames. Somewhere outside, a stream murmured under the ice. Mary sat on a cot made of thick wool and elk hide, her legs stretched out in front of her. The trap had torn the skin, but Boon had wrapped the wound with steady hands and clean linen. He hadn't spoken much since. Now he crouched near the fire, stirring the pot with the back end of a hunting knife. His coat was tossed over a chair. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing scarred forearms browned by weather and time. He glanced at her foot again. "It'll bruise, maybe swell, but it ain't broken." She nodded stiffly. "Thank you." He didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the corner, picked up her torn dress, mud-streaked and bloodied at the hem, and began to stitch it back together with a coarse needle and sinew. Mary watched him, carefully. He did not leer at her, did not gawk. He worked with focus, the same way he handled wood or meat or iron, as if fixing her dress was just part of fixing the world. Her suspicion faded just slightly. Still, she didn't relax. Not fully. When the food was done, he spooned some into a tin bowl and placed it near her, then tossed a small pouch of dried berries and nuts beside it. "Eat," he said. She took the bowl, tasted the stew. It was rabbit, lean but tender. She ate slowly, eyes never quite leaving him. When she finished, Boon stood and reached for a thick fur blanket. He walked over and handed it to her, then turned and walked straight out the door. Mary blinked. She listened as his boots crunched through the snow, then stopped. She crawled carefully to the window and peered out. Boon had laid himself out on a slab of stone near the stream, arms crossed behind his head. He was looking up at the stars. The blanket in her lap was warm. She curled up on the cot. But sleep didn't come. Her eyes drifted around the cabin. Everything was neat, strangely so. Tools hung in perfect order on the walls. The firewood stack was cut even. The table had one chair and one place setting. Then, something caught her eye. A sketch, pinned to a wooden beam above a small writing table. Charcoal on parchment, faint, rough. But the shape, the posture, the eyes. It was her. Mary rose slowly and limped over. Her heart thudded. The drawing showed a woman curled in a blanket, asleep, her hair tangled, her brow furrowed. She recognized that moment. It was the night she nearly froze to death. Her hand trembled as she reached for the edge of the table. There, half open, was a small wooden chest. She lifted the lid. and stopped breathing. Inside was a folded piece of cloth, a scarf, once red, now dulled with age, edges frayed. Her mother's scarf, the same one she had wrapped around her neck during that storm, the one she had lost, the one she hadn't seen in over a year. Mary stood frozen. The fire cracked behind her. The wind whispered beneath the door. She closed the lid gently, backed away, sat on the edge of the bed. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned. Everything she had believed about Boon, about the man who stormed her wedding and stole her from disgrace, shifted. He had not just taken her. He had saved her once before, and she had forgotten him. Mary's fingers trembled as she held the scarf. It was her mother's wool, once a deep crimson, now dulled and weathered. Her initials, M, were still barely visible in the corner, stitched by hand when she was a child. She hadn't seen it in over a year. Not since. She closed her eyes, and the memory came flooding back. 1 year earlier, winter, 1871. The snowstorm had come fast, mean, and blinding. The wind screamed through the trees as Mary staggered deeper into the forest, clutching a small satchel of herbs she had gathered from the low thicket. Her mother had taken sick, coughing blood into the sheets, and the apothecary had closed early, so Mary had gone alone. A patch of ice, hidden beneath the powder, sent her sprawling. A sharp crack shot through her ankle. The world tilted sideways, then black. When she woke, it was dark. Firelight flickered behind her eyelids. She was warm, too warm for snow. She opened her eyes and saw wood beams, a roaring hearth, and shadows moving softly across a small cabin. And him. Boon Calder sat near the fire, sharpening a blade. His coat was slung over the chair. He looked like a figure carved out of the mountain, silent, solid. Mary tried to sit up and cried out. He was there in an instant, kneeling beside her. He said nothing, just handed her a cup of hot broth. She remembered the smell, juniper, onion, something wild. Her ankle was bound tight. She was wrapped in layers of hide and fur. Her scarf had fallen onto the floor beside her. "Where?" she whispered. "You're safe," Boon had said. "Storm's still coming. You'll stay till it passes." She stayed for 3 days. They barely spoke. Boon fed her, brewed teas from roots and leaves she didn't recognize, rubbed poultices into her bruised ankle. He never touched her more than needed, never looked at her too long. But his presence filled the room like a second fire. At night, when the winds howled outside, she curled in the cot near the fire while he sat by the door, knife in hand, watching the woods. And somehow, she felt safe. On the third night, as the storm began to break, and the silence between them thinned, she looked across the fire and asked quietly, "Why did you save me?" Boon didn't look up, but after a long pause, he said, "Because I've lived like a beast for a long time, and you reminded me I was once a man." His voice cracked a little, not from sorrow, just from use. She didn't know what to say, but the words stuck with her. The next morning, the skies cleared. Boon helped her to her feet, and she limped back toward town, with the herbs still tucked in her bag. At the edge of the forest, before she left, she had turned to him and said, "I'll come back." He had only nodded, but she never did, because that very night, when her parents found out where she had been, they locked her in her room, called her wicked, shameful, unfit for marriage if word got out. They told the town she'd had a fever. They threw out her scarf, and they never let her near the woods again. Now, back in Boon's cabin, Mary sat frozen, the scarf pressed to her chest, the fire behind her casting long shadows on the wall. Outside, the wind had picked up again. She limped to the doorway and pushed it open. There he was, Boon, lying on the stone near the stream, one arm behind his head, staring up at the stars. The cold bit through her sleeves. She looked at him, really looked, at the man who had saved her once, had waited, had been forgotten, and then, tonight, had walked into a church and carried her out like a promise made flesh. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I'm sorry, I forgot." He did not move. but the wind carried her words all the same. And inside her, something cracked, not from guilt, but from the sudden, overwhelming memory of what it felt like to be seen and never judged. Not even once. In town, Harlan Dodd was a man unraveling. His pride had been gutted in front of half the valley, the bride stolen, the church silenced, the whispers growing like weeds in every corner of the Flive, saloon, and stables. He could not let it stand, not with his name on every cattle brand in 2 counties. By sundown the next day, he had hired 3 men with long coats and longer rifles, men who did not ask questions, only how far and how fast. One of them, a trapper with a scar across his jaw, said he knew of a cabin near the high ridge, Dead Elk Pass. "There's a stream that runs under the bluff," the trapper added. "Used to be an old hunter's place. Ain't seen no smoke there in years, but he might have gone back to it." "Then we ride tonight," Harlan spat. In the forest, Boon noticed the prints almost at once. They weren't fresh, but fresh enough to worry him. The snow was disturbed near the trailhead, 4 sets of boots. Not local hunters, too heavy, too fast. He doubled back toward the cabin, face grim. Inside, Mary was tending to the fire. She looked up when he entered. "We don't have much time," Boon said. "They're coming." Her heart seized. He crouched near the hearth, grabbed a piece of charcoal, and began to sketch crude shapes on the floor. The trail, the stream, the high ridge. "If I don't come back," he said, "you head north, follow the creek. It'll split near the stone arch. Keep left, there's a cave near the waterline. Hide there till nightfall." Mary's voice cracked. "Don't say that. Don't talk like you won't come back." Boon looked at her then, really looked, and something in his eyes softened, but he stood and walked to the door. The sun had vanished. Night crept through the trees like a thief. He left without another word. She found the message an hour later. 3 stones on the doorstep, shaped like an arrow pointing north. Beneath them, scratched faintly into bark, "Run only if I fall." Mary paced the cabin, breath short, then grabbed her boots, the only pair she had, and slipped outside into the cold. She would not wait again. The gunshots came just before dawn. A sharp crack echoed across the ridge, then another. Snow flew up in bursts as bullets tore through the underbrush. Boon had led them into a ravine, hoping to funnel their horses between rocks too narrow to maneuver. He moved like the mountain, silent, swift, brutal. He dropped the first man with a rock to the temple. The second grazed his arm with a shot that tore the fabric of his coat. Then Harlan appeared, his face red, eyes wild, teeth clenched in fury. "You think you can take what's mine?" he shouted, raising the rifle. Boon didn't reply. The shot fired. Boon spun, the bullet grazing his shoulder. He stumbled back. And then Mary appeared from the trees. "Boon." He turned just as a second gunman aimed for her. Boon lunged forward, knocking her to the ground. The second shot rang out. This time, it hit. His body jerked as the bullet buried itself in his upper shoulder. Mary screamed. Snow swallowed them as they tumbled behind a boulder. Boon grunted, blood soaking through the side of his coat. "Stay down," he rasped. Mary's hands were already moving. She tore strips from her dress, pressed them to the wound. Her fingers shook, but her mind was clear. She had seen this before, on animals, on her brother's leg during a plow accident. "Stop the bleeding. Keep him warm." "You saved me again," she whispered, tightening the knot. "Now it's my turn." Gunfire echoed in the distance as the hired men scattered, realizing the trap had turned. Mary helped Boon to his feet. He leaned heavily on her, but his legs held. They slipped into a narrow gorge just beyond the ravine, the walls high and jagged, snow falling like ash. When they finally collapsed beside a frozen log, the forest was quiet. Mary pulled him close, arms wrapped around his chest, her breath warm against his neck. Boone's breathing slowed, his eyes fluttered shut. Mary leaned in, her lips near his ear. "This time," she whispered, voice steady, "I won't leave you." The fire burned low in the hearth, casting flickers of orange across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had quieted, but the chill remained, seeping in through the gaps in the wooden slats. Boon lay still on the cot, pale, sweat dotting his brow, his chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. Mary worked beside him, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hands trembling but steady in their task. She boiled a mix of roots and dried herbs in a pot over the fire, the broth thick and bitter-smelling. Beside her, a strip of linen soaked red in a bowl of cold water. She had already cleaned the wound, stitched it shut with needle and thread pulled from the emergency kit beneath the shelf. She had never done that before. Not on a man, but her fingers had remembered things the heart could not forget. She changed the bandage gently, pressed the poultice against the angry flesh, then sat back, breath hitching. Boon did not wake. She turned to the small wooden chest under his work table. Inside, she found it again. The sketch, her sleeping, face soft in firelight, her scarf, folded carefully, edges worn, and a slip of parchment, smudged and creased, with words scratched in a shaky hand. She said she'd come back. Mary pressed the note to her chest. She remembered the house back in town, the polished floorboards, the heavy curtains, her mother's cold eyes, her father's silence. She remembered the laughter at the church, the way her bare feet touched the aisle, the heat of shame, and then Boon's arms. And here he was now, wounded, still, silent, but not gone. She sat beside him, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth. The hours passed. Just before dawn, he stirred. His eyes fluttered open, focused on her. He blinked, tried to sit up, failed. "Easy," she whispered. He swallowed, voice hoarse. "You stayed." "I did." "If you want to leave," he rasped, "I will not stop you. Not this time." Mary looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and placed her hand gently over his chest, just above the fresh stitches. "No," she said. "I left you once. I won't make that mistake again." His eyes didn't shine. They never did. But something softened in them. He reached slowly into the satchel near his bedroll and pulled out a small, smooth object. A stone. It was heart-shaped, worn down by time and thumbprints, edges polished to a gentle sheen. "I found this," he said, "the day you left, the day the snow cleared. Thought it might be yours." He turned it in his hand. "I kept it. Figured it could hold the place of a promise." Mary took it from him, her fingers closing around its warmth. Tears slid down her cheeks. "Then let me keep it now," she said, voice breaking, "because I've come back, and this time I'm staying." 1 year had passed. The town hadn't changed much. The same dust in the street, the same crooked signs over the shops, the same church, still leaning to the east. But something in the air had shifted. Boon and Mary walked side by side down the center of Main Street. She wore a plain linen dress, the hem brushing against her bare ankles. Her feet, as ever, were unshod. Her hair was braided neatly down her back. Boon towered next to her, quiet as ever, his shadow long in the morning sun. People turned as they passed. Some paused in their chores. Some lowered their voices. But no one laughed. A few men touched their hats. One older woman gave a soft, reverent nod. A little girl clutched her mother's hand and whispered, "Mama, she looks like a forest princess." Her mother smiled, but said nothing. Harlan Dodd was gone. He'd left town after the scandal, after the wedding that never was. After it came out he'd tried to shoot a man in cold blood. Some said he ran to Arizona. Others said he drank himself off the trail. No one missed him. Mary's parents lived quieter now. Their name no longer opened doors. Truth had a way of surfacing in a town that small. Boon and Mary stopped at the land office. Paperwork in hand, the clerk didn't ask questions. He stamped the claim and slid it back across the desk. "Dead Elk Ridge is all yours," he said. "Good luck up there." Boon nodded. They didn't linger. Instead, they walked to the edge of town, to the church. It stood silent, unused for nearly a year. Dust on the pews, cobwebs in the corners, but the altar still stood, and the stained glass caught the light just the same. Boon pushed the door open, and Mary stepped inside, cradling a small bundle in her arms. Their daughter. The infant stirred, but did not cry. A new preacher stood waiting, a young man from the valley, hands folded in quiet reverence. Boon and Mary said nothing as they approached the altar. Mary knelt and gently placed the child on the stone steps, the very ones where she had once stood, barefoot, humiliated, mocked by the same town that now watched from windows with quiet awe. The baby cooed. Mary looked down at her. Her voice, soft but strong, filled the space that had once held judgment. Once, a girl walked here barefoot and was laughed at, scorned, shamed. But today, she smiled through tears. Today, her daughter begins from that same stone, not in shame, but in freedom. The preacher nodded and began the prayer. Boon stood behind them, silent, one hand resting on Mary's shoulder. Snow began to fall outside. After the blessing, they stepped from the church, Mary holding the child, Boon at her side. The townspeople watched from porches, from windows, from shop doors. No one laughed. Not this time. Just eyes that followed them quietly, and hearts that, for reasons they couldn't quite name, stood still in reverent silence. And so, from barefoot shame to a chapel reborn, Mary and Boon carved out a life that defied every whisper, every rule, every chain. Love is not always loud. Sometimes, it's the quiet hand that lifts you from the snow, the silent promise kept in a cabin drawer, the step taken barefoot, but unafraid. If this story touched your heart, go ahead and hit that hype button and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. We bring you unforgettable tales of passion, courage, and love that conquered the untamed American frontier. Turn on the bell so you never miss a moment where bullets missed, but hearts didn't. Until next time, ride steady and love wilder.